Well, welcome everyone, and we are going to have a few Bible with Bills, where Bill helps give more of the background to Romans, which we're going through every Sunday, once a month. Bill's taking us through Romans as long as it takes, which
Absolutely.
is super exciting for all
Which
of
is a
us.
long time.
But Bill also very kindly wanted to give some of the more in the weeds theology, biblical studies stuff to help us in our listening on those Sundays and our processing. So we're super excited about that. Thank you, Bill. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Alice. Thank you for having me. That's really the idea. I think the Sunday talks are really about the gospel. So they're asking the question, what is the gospel? And so they'll be drawing from Romans, I think, more than any other book, but they're not really an exploration of Romans. And so the idea is that these podcasts, if that's what they are, that run alongside the Sunday mornings for the Sunday series, that these kind of show the working, so these are, because the thing is, Romans is a really difficult book. It's not easy to read. It's complex. There's an awful lot of theological terms which are quite hard to get our heads around, and so it's very easy to kind of. I find if I think back to my experience of reading Romans, often it's looked like knowing Romans is really important. Everyone says, it's one of the most important books of the New Testament, if not the whole Bible. Therefore, we really ought to know it, and we really ought to read it well. And so I'll resolve to read Romans, and after 5 verses, I'm thinking, hang on a minute, I'm getting lost here. Where are we? What do these words mean? It's so complicated, it's so involved. And so the idea of these podcasts this year is to help to read Romans well, to begin to make sense of what Paul's argument is and how it all fits together, if that's all right.
Perfect.
So the idea of this one is kind of to set the stage, and it's my aim this morning is to introduce 7 principles or 7 hints, tips on how to read Romans well, but also how to read Romans slightly easier, how to find it more accessible and less intimidating and less complicated. So I've come up with 7 principles on how to read Romans. But there's a caution, first of all. And my caution is this. Let me read a little bit from Martin Luther, one of my heroes. And Martin says, Romans is the chief part of the New Testament, the purest gospel, and every Christian should know it word for word by heart, as daily bread for the soul. We can never read it or ponder it too much. And the trouble is, I agree with him, but what that means is I feel like anyone who tries to read Romans is on a journey that is never ending. I was thinking, I'm 60 next week. Did you know that, Alice?
Woohoo!
Yeah, absolutely.
That is super exciting.
It's very exciting. I don't like to make a big fuss about it, but I am 60. I am 60 next week. But I was thinking, when I was 40, I read Romans and I understood a bit about Romans. I think now I'm 60, I understand Romans a lot better than I did when I was 40. But I'm sure when I'm 80, if I live that long, I'll look back and think, oh, when I was 60, I didn't really understand Romans at all. Now I really understand it. And I think it's one of those books that the longer you live with it, it's so deep and so rich and so complex that you're never done. You never really understand it. And so I suppose that's I kind of want to wave a flag of humility at the start and say, look, what I'm going to be doing this year is a kind of snapshot of where I am today. It's a bit like Tom Wright says. Tom Wright, he says he's sure that 20% of what he believes is wrong. The trouble is he doesn't know which 20%. And it's kind of like that. I'm sure I'm sure I'll be saying things this year that in 20 years' time I'll look back on and think, oh no, that's been embarrassing. But overall, I think the aim is to. What I'd love is if this can be a journey we kind of go on together. And so if these podcasts start a conversation within Hope Chapel, if even if it's just me and one other person who decides to read Romans, and we end up talking about what righteousness means, or whatever it is, then I think that's worthwhile. So come on with me on this journey of exploring Romans. Okay, so Alice, are you ready for the first of our 7 principles?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Number 1. Romans is a letter and not an essay. And the trouble is, it gets treated as though it is a theology textbook by a lot of Christians and theologians. And I think the reason is that it is Paul's most kind of fully worked out, most rounded, most complete presentation of the gospel. And so a lot of people assume that it is Paul's presentation of the gospel, that it is his kind of attempt at writing a theology. It's much more complete and it's much more careful, I'd say, than something like Galatians, which is drawing from the same source. It's kind of arguing the same argument, but Galatians is really an attack. It's a polemic. Paul is just angry. Whereas Romans is much more careful, it's much more thorough, it's much more full and fleshed out. But it's still a letter, and it needs to be read as a letter. If you're trying to interpret a letter, and this is stuff I've talked about before, particularly because so much of the New Testament is letters. If you want to understand what a letter is saying, you need to think about who is the writer and what's their situation, who is it intended to be read by or heard by, or what's their situation, and what's the argument, what's the purpose of the letter, what's the cause of writing it, and if you're clear about those things, or at least if you try and work out the answers to those 3 things, you're going to have a much better chance of working out what the letter's saying. The thing is that there are some things we know for sure about who wrote it and when and where he was and that kind of thing. And there are some things we know for sure about who it was intended to be read by. We can make some pretty good assumptions or reasonable guesses about some of the other stuff in order to fill in that picture of who was writing, who was it intended to be read by, and what was the occasion of the letter, what was the purpose of the letter. Some of it is guesswork, some of it is reasonable assumptions, but the thing is we always make those assumptions anyway. Even if you read Romans without thinking at all about who was the writer, who was the recipient, and what was the occasion, you're still going to make assumptions. And so it's really essential that we do our best to try and come up with good answers to those questions rather than just the answer we first thought of, if you see what I mean. And I'll say a lot more about that principle as we go through. So here's how I think it works, the relationship between the gospel and the letter to the Romans. So as far as I can see, the gospel is Paul's complete understanding of everything that God has done through Jesus to save people. So it's everything that God has done through the birth, life, death, resurrection and ascension of Jesus and the giving of the Holy Spirit. So everything that God has done in order to change the course of history, and the good news of what God has done in and through Jesus, that is what Paul means by his gospel. You know, the gospel with a capital G. But that's a big picture, and that covers an awful lot of things. It covers the present day, and it covers the future. It covers individuals, and it covers nations, and it covers the whole of creation. You know, it's a big thing. But it's like that is Paul's resource to make an argument to the Romans. And so he draws from the gospel, he draws from his big bag of understanding of what God's done, in order to come up with an argument to deal with a particular problem in a particular place with a particular bunch of people. And so he emphasizes some things and not others. And I think the mistake is when we read Romans and we think, well, that is the gospel, that's the whole gospel. If we understand the situation of the Romans and who the people are that are concerned, then we'll begin to be able to piece together what is fundamental principle that Paul believes is the gospel, and what is something that he's tailoring and emphasizing and directing to meet this particular situation. That's what we're going to be exploring this year. Okay, so it's a letter, not an essay. You ready for principle number 2? Are we all right? How are we doing?
Good.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So, first of all, Paul's situation. So, fortunately, if we think about Paul's situation, the letter itself helps us a lot, because right at the end, or the second half of chapter 15 and into chapter 16, Paul tells us what his situation is, and in particular, he tells us what his plans are. And this really helps to understand who's writing it and why he's writing it. So let's have a little look. This is where Paul is. So I don't know if does that come over? Can you see the line? So Paul is writing from Cenchrea, which is the port right next door to Corinth. The isthmus of Corinth is the little bit of land in between Corinth and Cenchrea. And he's halfway through this big journey he's been on. He's travelled all the way through Macedonia, what we now say is northern Greece. So he's visited Thessalonica and Philippi, and he's come down and he's spent some time in Corinth, and he's about to leave Cenchrea in order to head on to Jerusalem. So, but while he's in Cenchrea, he writes this letter to Rome, and this is end of 56, beginning of 57. Most people think it's about winter 56 into early 57. He sends this letter. But in the letter, he explains what his plans are. And he explains, look, I'm going to Jerusalem, and the main reason I'm going to Jerusalem is I'm organising this great big collection, this money. And particularly these churches in Greece, which are wealthier than the Christians in Jerusalem, they've been really generous. They've collected together this big sum of money, and I'm going to take it to the brothers in Jerusalem. But having done that, I'm going to come and visit you in Rome. Okay, so this is Paul's future plans. Once he's been to Jerusalem, once he's dropped off the gift and spent some time in Jerusalem, he's going to go to, and you need to imagine the map, the map heading, he's going to go west. And this is the key thing. All of Paul's missionary activities so far, his 3 journeys, have been in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So roughly the area in this map. This is where he's planted churches so far. But his plan, his strategy, is he's going to do something completely different. And he's going to go to Spain. Like some of us do for our holidays, Paul is going to go to Spain. But for Paul, it's not a holiday. He's not going to lie on a beach in Benidorm. He is going to plant churches in the western part of the Roman Empire. And I think his thinking is Rome is going to be the springboard for this big new move, his next missionary activity in Spain, in the western part of the Roman Empire. And I think there are a couple of things going on here. First is, Rome is absolutely key anyway. You know, it's the centre of the empire. So if you're looking for resources, if you're looking for people, if you're looking for material resources to support this big new move into the western heart of the empire, then wouldn't it be brilliant to have the support of this church in Rome? It's a big church, there's plenty of wealthy people there, they could be crucial. There's another thing, which is this part, the eastern part of the Roman Empire, speaks Greek. The western part speaks Latin. So Paul, he knows lots of people who speak Greek. Everyone in this area speaks Greek. But this is a new move. And so where do you find Latin speakers? You know, if he can make friends with and gain the support of the big church, the big Christian community in Rome, then one of the key barriers to launching a mission trip to the western part of the western part of the Roman Empire is going to be overcome. And I think that's his thinking. And so he sends this letter ahead to kind of prepare the way, to announce that he's coming to visit them. He's going to spend some time with them, and you know, he's not just passing through. He wants to invest in them, but above all, he's looking for their support. So that's his situation. I think as well, he's a strategic thinker. If the church in Rome is healthy, if the church in Rome is passionate about the gospel, then even apart from Paul's own mission, it's going to have a huge influence. You know, everyone is passing through Rome, heading east, heading west. The healthier, the stronger the Christian church is in Rome, the more the gospel is going to spread anyway, whether Paul's involved or not. And so that's Paul's situation, but there's a problem, I think. And to think about the problem, we now need to move on to the situation in Rome. Because that's Paul's agenda. I think that's, if everything goes well, that's how he sees it working out. But I think the thing that's driving the letter is there is an issue. And understanding what that issue is key to understanding the letter to the Romans. Okay? With me so far?
Absolutely.
Okay, so number 3, the situation. What's going on in Rome? The Christian community in Rome seems to be pretty big. We can infer that from the size of the Jewish community. Historians estimate there are between 15,000 and 60,000 Jews in Rome. And so, by implication, there would also be a large number of Christians. For example, if you read in Acts 2, Peter's speech on the day of Pentecost, he stands up and he's in Jerusalem, but Luke, in writing Acts, he makes the case that there are lots of visitors to Jerusalem on the festival of Pentecost, and they would have taken Peter's message back home with them. And Luke specifies that some of the people there that day are Jews from Rome, part of this big Jewish population in Rome. And so you can kind of imagine, there may well have been some Jews from Rome who were in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost, who heard Peter's message and took it back with them to Rome. I think that's quite reasonable to assume. Certainly, the church in Rome, or the Christian community in Rome, was quite long established before Paul wrote to them. It was up and running. But it seems to have been quite divided. How do we know this? It's the final chapter of Romans, he kind of says hello to about 30 different people. Most of chapter 16 is this long list of greetings, and they're all sorts of different people, but he kind of speaks to different households, and the picture we get is that there wasn't a single church in Rome. There were a number of different churches in Rome, maybe 5 or 6 or maybe many more kind of house churches. And the thing that's really striking is in this letter, Paul never calls them an ecclesia. In all of his other letters, he writes to the Thessalonians or the Philippians or the Corinthians, and he calls them the ecclesia. We would say the church, but what it really means is the assembly, the gathering together of all the believers in that city are the ecclesia, the assembly. And he never calls the community in Rome an ecclesia. Now that may mean nothing, or it may be significant. But the suggestion is they're not really united. They're not together. And in fact, as we put the jigsaw bits together, what we'll see is they really weren't united. There really was an issue. So just that fact that he doesn't call them an ecclesia suggests there may have been problems. And in fact, there was one issue, or at least in this letter, there is one key issue that dominates, and that is the conflict, the disunity between Jewish believers, or Christians with a Jewish ethnic heritage, and Christians with a Gentile heritage. So it's not about Jews versus Christians. A lot of people read Romans and think it's an argument between Jews and Christians. It's not. It's an argument between Christians, but it's an argument between Jewish Christians, Messianic Jews, and Gentile Christians. And this is the issue. This is the problem. The poor relations between these two groups is the issue that shapes the letter and that dominates the letter in all sorts of different ways. Let's think a little bit about where those tensions may have come from. Just culturally, think about we're in the heart of the Roman Empire. You don't get more Roman than Rome. And think about the culture of Rome and Romans. And then think about the culture of Jewish people. Let me give you one little example. The last 15 Roman emperors, how many of them did not have homosexual lovers? One. Only one out of the last 15 didn't have male lovers, which is interesting, but that's just an example of the Roman attitude to sex. Now think about the Jewish attitude to sex and how squeamish how fussy they must have seemed to Romans, to cultural Romans, in their attitude to sex. And especially the question of homosexuality. It's no wonder that in the letter to the Romans, one of the things that raises its head early on is the issue of homosexuality, just because of the cultural differences. Then think about the kind of funny mixture in Rome between politics and religion, the kind of imperial cult. If you were a good Roman, then your attitude towards the emperor was that he was some kind of god. That in Rome at this time, that was the direction it was moving in. The claims being made by the emperor. And often what was said about the propaganda about the Roman Empire was very much that the success of the empire was a manifestation of spiritual truths as well as political truths. And again, think about how that goes down with your typical Jew. It's an inevitable area of clash. But there was a particular issue that we know about from the history books. So this is the Emperor Claudius. So remember, we've got this large population of Jews in Rome, between 15 and 60,000. In the year 49 AD, so that's less than 10 years before Paul writes his letter, it all kicked off between the Jews and the Gentiles in Rome. We're not exactly sure what the problem was, but there was an outbreak of civil unrest. And in response, Claudius bans the Jews from Rome. He sends them away. They're not allowed in Rome. We don't know exactly what caused it, but interestingly, I think it's Suetonius, the historian. He talks about this trouble stirred up by Chrestus. And now, is Chrestus just a Jewish guy, or is it some kind of misunderstanding and it was about Christ? It was an argument over the identity of Christ. Was Jesus Christ or not? Or was that what was going on? We're not sure. But whatever, the result was large numbers of Jews had to leave Rome. And I love this. In Acts 18, Paul goes to Corinth for the first time. Who does he live with? He lives with Priscilla and Aquila, who he meets. They're Jews who've ended up in Corinth. But in the book of Acts, they're described as Jews from Rome. They happen to be living in Corinth because they've been expelled from Rome by the Emperor Claudius. So Priscilla and Aquila are part of this exodus of Jews from Rome. So in about 5 years later, I think, about 54 AD, Claudius dies and Nero is the new emperor, and the Jews gradually come back. But just imagine, you've got a little Christian community in Rome, lots of different house churches, and most of the leading lights in that community, the heads of the households where this community was meeting, they would probably have been Jewish. You've then had 5 years where the Jews are expelled. What's going to happen in that time? A lot of those roles will then be taken by Gentile believers. And now the Jews have come back, and suddenly they find that they're no longer in charge, but also that there are changes underway. A lot of what they hold dear culturally, or in terms of lifestyle, has been ditched. And it just feels a lot more Roman and a lot less Jewish to be in these communities. So that's historically the situation. And I think understanding this kind of social, cultural, political situation helps us to understand so much about the Book of Romans. For example, let me give you one example. Romans 13 is really controversial because in Romans 13, Paul talks about submission to authorities and how important it is that believers submit to the human authorities where they live. Excuse me, my phone's going off. I'm just going to see who it is. They can call back.
It's a very civilised ringtone.
It's a very civil. Would you like to know what it is, Alice?
Yeah, I would.
It is Bach Suite in B minor, Flute Suite in B minor.
There you go.
There you go. I'm just going to move it to silent so we don't get interrupted again.
Brilliant.
This is like the ad break. If you're listening to a
is,
proper
yeah.
podcast,
We
there'd be an
could-
ad break halfway through.
We could be doing product placement and everything.
We
couldn't
could. And also you could join our club and then you could listen ad free. So I think we need to set
Yes.
that up. Anyway, so Romans 13, Paul says, submit to human authorities. And ever since he wrote that, Christians have the time of the Third Reich, Christians in Germany, there were some Christians saying, well, Paul says in Romans 13 you should submit to the authorities, therefore we need to respect Hitler. And, there are others saying, well, that's ridiculous. If we understand, we can read what Paul wrote, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what he meant. And the historical context really helps to tell us what he meant by what he wrote and why he wrote what he did. And if we think about what he wrote in Romans 13, it makes perfect sense for that situation in Rome at that time. The large numbers of the church have just been expelled from Rome because of their, rebellious tendencies or whatever it was that stirred up the unrest. Paul's main priority is the gospel. I think he's thinking, look, if we just let the civil authorities get on with what they do, and we do what we can concentrate on what we do, the most important thing we do, which is understanding the gospel, living by it and sharing it, then we can rub along. But he's not talking about Nazi Germany. We need to understand the context. Okay, are you ready for the next one? We're about halfway through. Is this all right?
Perfect.
It's not dragging too much?
This is
I
great.
always think I get lost in the weeds a bit, but here we go. Crucially, so we've looked at who wrote it and what was their situation, who was intended to read it, and what can we try and piece together about their situation, the Christians in Rome. Fundamentally, what is the argument that Paul is making in this letter? And it really is an argument. He is piecing together a very careful argument. And it's interesting, often he uses a Greek rhetorical technique called a diatribe. Now when we use the word today, when we say, oh, it's a real diatribe, we tend to mean someone having a rant. But in terms of Greek rhetoric, a diatribe is when you conduct an argument with an imaginary opponent. So you kind of you're asking questions and answering questions. You're imagining what their position is, and you're responding to that. And you kind of you're only listening to one side of the argument, but what the person's saying kind of conjures up this picture of a two-way conversation, and specifically an argument, a diatribe. And Paul uses that technique in lots of different places in this letter. So he really is carrying out an argument. And the trouble we're wrestling with when we read Romans is that people have assumed in the past what the argument is, and that assumption about what the argument is has shaped our understanding of what Romans is all about and what it means. In particular, I'm talking about Martin Luther. So don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan. I like Martin Luther a lot. I think he's excellent. But when Martin Luther read Romans, he made an assumption about the argument that Paul was having with the people Paul was writing to. And in particular, he assumed that the people Paul was arguing with were making the same argument back as they were engaged in the same argument as the argument that Luther was having with the Roman Catholic authorities. He kind of read his situation into Paul's situation. And so much of our understanding of what's going on in Romans has been shaped by that understanding. Luther assumed that what Paul was dealing with was religious leaders who were insisting that people did certain things in order to win God's acceptance. And when he read about works, he thought earning. The idea that people can earn God's mercy, can earn God's forgiveness, can earn God's righteousness by doing certain things. In the Roman Catholic Church's cases, by giving money. And for hundreds of years, that was the assumption that shaped people's reading of Romans. About 50 years ago, an American scholar called Ed Sanders produced a book which completely shattered that understanding. Now, Ed Sanders is fascinating because he's not a Christian. He was a historian, but his particular interest was Jewish religion. And his whole area of research was, what did Jews believe at the time of Jesus and at the time of Paul? And he wrote this book in 1977 called Paul and Palestinian Judaism. And it was a very, very thorough study looking at what Jews believed at the time of Paul. And he couldn't find a single example of Jews who were trying to earn their salvation and earn forgiveness and earn God's love by doing works, by working, by effort, or by obeying the law. Jews didn't believe that obeying the law was what got you into God's people and into God's kingdom. Jews believed that being a member of God's people was pure grace. It was the gift of God. It was God's initiative. He had rescued them. He had saved them. And their obedience to the law was about their response to what God had already done. It wasn't about earning a place in God's kingdom. It was about staying in God's kingdom. It wasn't about getting in. It was about staying in. And so ever since Sanders did this, produced this book, and revolutionized our understanding of the argument that Paul was having, many theologians have had to rethink their understanding of the letter to the Romans. And the trouble is, many Christians, many churches, even though it's been 50 years, they're still kind of wrestling with the legacy of Luther. And they think that Paul is having a different argument with the Romans from the one he's actually having. So what is Paul's actual argument? I heard this brilliant illustration the other day, or I read this brilliant illustration. There's a theologian called Morna Hooker, and she made this analogy, which is, if you think about Methodists and Anglicans, from our situation today, we look at Methodists and Anglicans and we think, well, they're two different denominations. And they are today. But the very origins of Methodism happened entirely within the Anglican Church. Wesley, Whitfield, all of the original they were Anglicans. And they were Anglicans who, to begin with, were Anglicans with a slightly different flavour. But their identity was Anglicans. They didn't call themselves Methodists. They were a sect. Technically they were a sect within Anglicanism. And the change from being a sect of Anglicans to being Methodists happened very gradually. And most people didn't realise at the time that that's what was happening. No one knew that was how it was going to work out. And I think that's a really good analogy for what's going on in Rome. a lot of people would have assumed that being a Jesus follower was something you did within Judaism. That this was a flavour of Judaism, and that people's identity was first of all Jewish, and they were Jewish and also Jesus followers. And the trouble is then, what happens when people who aren't ethnic Jews become Jesus followers? How Jewish do they need to become in order to become a Jesus follower? And that was the thing. That seems to have been the argument that was dividing the church in Rome, and the argument that Paul is wrestling with in this letter is, how Jewish do you need to become in order to be a Jesus follower? And if we can get our heads around that, then so much of what Paul is saying in the letter will begin to make more sense. In particular, when Paul talks about works, he's talking about specific actions within the Jewish law. He's not talking about effort. He's not talking about trying hard. He's not talking about trying to do good or be good. What he's talking about, works of the law, is about, the law is Torah. But even more than that, this is diaspora Judaism. This is Judaism that's left Jerusalem far behind. So they no longer have the temple, the sacrifices, the priesthood. They're trying to retain their Jewish identity a long, long way from Jerusalem. And so how do they do it? Well, they cling on to certain things. And it seems that in sociological terms, that sociologists talk about boundary markers. What are the actions which people cling to in order to maintain their identity? And so there were certain things that the Jews in Rome would stress really highly in order to kind of maintain their difference and to identify themselves as Jewish. And in particular, that seems to have been circumcision and food laws. And those are the things which Paul is talking about. And so that's the argument that's going on. But it gets tricky, because a lot of people now, the pendulum has swung the other way, and a lot of people reject Luther. And the thing about Luther is he got most of it right. And compared with most of his contemporaries, he got a lot more right than they were getting right. Because what he got absolutely right was Paul's position. Paul's position was that we're justified by grace through faith. And Luther recognized that, and he was absolutely right. That is what Paul said, and that's a fundamental part of Paul's gospel. We are justified by grace through faith. The only thing that Luther misunderstood was what his opponents were saying. And so we shouldn't reject everything that Luther believed just because he got that one bit wrong. But so we need to be careful about whose side we're on. And it's actually unhelpful to see ourselves on anyone's side other than Paul's. The real problem with this is we're kind of at the end of 500 years worth of argument about this. And the trouble is when people have been arguing about something for 500 years, positions become really entrenched. And it becomes so easy to see ourselves as the good guys and the others as the bad guys. And kind of to for the argument to shape what's most important. I was thinking about Brexit, and I always think about how the more the Brexit argument went on and the more entrenched positions became, the more the question of membership of the EU mattered, the more important it became, until it became the only thing that mattered. Whereas 5 years before the Brexit vote, most people didn't care whether we were in the EU or out. It was a kind of minor issue. The trouble was the more the argument went on, the more important it became that we remained or that we left. And I think it's a bit like that. It's the longer the argument between Catholics and Protestants went on, the more important the question of earning God's love or earning God's forgiveness became. so that the gospel, the whole gospel became, you can't earn God's love, you can't earn God's forgiveness. Whereas actually that was never the question in the first place. But anyway, we are where we are. So we'll probably come back to this over this year. But our challenge is to try and set aside a lot of what, and try and unlearn a lot of what we have learned about words like justify and grace and that kind of thing, and works. Because as soon as we hear those words, it's very easy to get into that Protestant versus Catholic mindset. And if that's what's filling our minds, we'll crowd out what Paul is actually saying. Okay?
Yeah.
Any questions?
Total sense. Yeah,
Good.
that's helpful.
So, three more, slightly shorter, hopefully, ones to finish. First of all, let Paul define his own terms. Romans is full of key words, which are big, rich, complex words. Whole concepts, whole pictures and stories summed up in a single word. Words like grace and faith and righteousness and sin and flesh. And it's very easy to read one of these words and assume that it means what we think it means. Whereas in the letter, Paul unpacks them and he explains them. He explains what he means. And it's really important to let him do that and not to assume that when we read grace, we mean the same thing as what Paul means. So many people read a few verses in Romans and then skip over all of Paul's explanations and illustrations of what he means by these words. Let me give you one little example. I think probably the most famous passage in Romans is Romans chapter 3, just 6 verses, where Paul kind of sums up in incredibly concentrated form. I mean, it's like tomato puree. It's so rich and thick, and so this is Paul's first kind of presentation of God's solution to mankind's problem. He says, "But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe." And so on and so on. So verses 21 to 26. But there are so many questions just from those. What do you mean by righteousness? What do you mean by justify? What do you mean by faith? What do you mean by grace? And we can't begin to understand those 6 verses unless we unpack what those words mean. But the thing is, the next 5 chapters, Paul does exactly that. He unpacks what those words mean. For example, the next chapter, chapter 4, is all about faith. He answers exactly that question. What does faith mean? When you say faith, Paul, what do you mean by that? What does it look like? How can we understand what faith really is? And he uses the example of Abraham. He tells a story of Abraham, and he says, look, this is a picture, this is the paradigm of faith. And if we want to understand what faith means, and the kind of faith that God is looking for as a response to the gospel, then read chapter 4. But so many people just read, chapter 3, 21 to 26, without allowing Paul to explain his terms. So let Paul define his own terms, and very much linked to that, Paul uses a Hebrew worldview, an Old Testament worldview, to define his terms. It's one of the most striking things in Romans, the number of Old Testament stories, quotations, allusions, echoes, which Paul uses to explain his gospel. The thing is, he uses them sometimes in a very disguised way. One of my favourites is in the second half of chapter 1, verses 18 to 32. Paul kind of outlines the problem, and it's like the great decline of humanity. And it starts, for the wrath of God is being poured out. And he describes how humans have gone wrong. And the thing is, it's pure Genesis 3. It's a Hebrew understanding of the problem with the Gentile world. Or at least that's how it had come to be understood in Paul's day. Paul is retelling Genesis 3 in those 20 verses, but he does it in Greek language. He uses Greek rhetoric, he uses Stoic language and vocabulary, and so you don't get trees and fruit, you don't get a talking snake, but you get exactly the same principles but expressed in Greek language. And all the time Paul is drawing from Old Testament theology to explain the Christian gospel. And because a lot of Christians are allergic to the Old Testament, we can kind of miss so much of Paul's meaning unless we allow him to do that. Unless we, when we're trying to understand what he's talking about, unless we go back and think about the Old Testament version. Let me give you one example. So Paul's word righteousness. What does Paul mean by righteousness? Well, in the Greek worldview, righteousness was an ethical standard, but it was a very objective ethical standard. It was about keeping score. Here is a set of behaviors which are right, and you've got 96% and you've only got 27%. That is a Greek understanding of how righteousness works. The Hebrew worldview was a bit different, because at the heart of a Hebrew understanding of righteousness is relationship. It's an interpersonal term, and fundamentally that righteousness is a good relationship between two people. And restoring righteousness at its heart is about... Oh!
Excuse me, everyone.
Is it still running, Alice?
It is.
Okay.
Extraordinarily so. Righteousness is restoring relationships in the Hebrew worldview.
That's really fun. You should have held on tighter, everyone.
Yeah.
You can't fall off the stand like that.
No.
Try now.
Yeah.
From now on, try really hard not to fall off the stand. So a Hebrew understanding is based at its heart. It's about good, right standing between people and good relationships between people. Faithful relationships between people. Now, cascading from that is a whole set of ethical behaviour. So, if you are maintaining a good relationship with someone, you should speak the truth. You should be honest. You shouldn't lie. You shouldn't steal. But the heart of it is about relationship. Now, out of those two understandings, the Greek view and the Hebrew view, which is closer to our view in the West today? I'd suggest we're probably closer. When we hear the word right, I mean, it's a slightly old-fashioned, slightly religious word, but most of us, I think, have slightly more of a Greek understanding, that it's about keeping score and being perfect. And so we come up with this idea that God is a kind of sin accountant who's there to keep score and to tell us, if we passed or not. That's just one example of how a Hebrew worldview, and recognizing where Paul is drawing all his understanding from, how that can shape our understanding both of Romans but also of the gospel. Okay?
Yeah.
Final point?
Yeah.
So, finally, for me this is the test of, are we reading it well or not? Are we reading Romans well? I would strongly suggest that all of Romans
fits together and builds towards a single coherent argument. And that if you understand who's writing it, who they're writing to, what the situation is, what the problem is, what the argument is, if you're understanding it well, then it all kind of fits and it all makes sense. Because Paul breaks it down into different parts, he considers different parts at different times, but all of his parts are building towards a single argument and a single message. And so a useful test is, how does this bit, if I've understood it well, how does it contribute to that big picture, to the overarching argument? Does it fit and does it contribute? Can we see how it's answering questions that people would have at that stage in the argument? Or does it feel like a non sequitur? You know, is it irrelevant? Are we scratching our heads wondering why Paul's headed off in this direction? It's a really useful confirmation that we're on the right lines if it all fits together. One example, chapters 9 to 11 are all about, well, what's the place of Jews, ethnic Jews, and ethnic Israel now that we understand what God has done in Jesus? So, you know, where does that leave Jewish people? Where does that leave God? Because, you know, God made all sorts of promises to the Jewish nation. Has he abandoned them now? Has he broken those promises? Has he walked away from those promises? If he's walked away from those promises, how can we trust these new promises about Jesus? These are the questions which you would absolutely have if you've been following Paul's argument up to that stage well, because his whole argument is about the relationship of Jesus followers to Jewish history and Jewish culture. And so those are absolutely the questions you'd have at that stage, and that's why he goes into this in those three chapters, chapters 9 to 11. This isn't a kind of off-in-the-weeds diversion which doesn't really fit. It's a fundamental part of the whole argument. And the trouble is, often people read Romans and they have the important bits and the extra bits. That they have the bits which are kind of the core, and often those bits become the lens through which you read the whole thing. And then there are other bits which we don't need to worry about. And the more we can see, the more we can avoid that. I mean, inevitably we come up with our own lens. We can't read it without reading through a certain interpretive lens. But the more we can kind of not prioritize one bit above another bit, the more we can say this is one argument and it all contributes and it all fits together, then I think the better understanding we will have of the book of Romans. I think that's it, Alice. So those are my seven principles. It's a letter, not an essay.
Yep.
Paul's situation, the situation in Rome, we need to understand those if we're going to understand this letter. What's the argument? Trying to set aside 500 years of actually the wrong argument. And then how do we understand these big words like grace and faith and righteousness? Paul defines them for us in the letter if we'll read it, but he also draws from his Jewish, his Hebrew scriptures, his Hebrew worldview. And then finally, how does it all fit together? I think the final thing I'd say is, as I said right at the start, I'd love this to be a kind of debate within our community, for others to be, wrestling with Romans as I'm wrestling with Romans. Please ask if you have any, if you're struggling to understand something, if there's something I've said either in these podcasts or on a Sunday morning which you're not sure about, or which jars because it's different from what you've heard before. If you want to know where I've got something, what I think about different positions, or different commentaries, and what's a good commentary, what's a bad commentary, that kind of thing, please just ask. Let's have a conversation. And next month we will look at what I think is the foundation for an awful lot of this understanding of the heart of the gospel. Is kind of Paul's starting point, his foundation for his argument, and the penny dropped for me about this 2 or 3 months ago, and it makes an awful lot of stuff an awful lot clearer. So we're going to look at that next time.
That is
Okay.
absolutely fantastic. Thank you, Bill, so much.
You're very welcome.
And we're really looking forward to that. And I love Bill's process, which we've talked about, is that Bill always sits in the text and in commentaries and until he gets personal revelation. So whilst this is how scholars are understanding and reading Romans now, it is also coming up from Bill's own revelation, which is really, really special and exciting. So thank you, Bill. And I'm just going to pray now.
You're welcome.
Because we really want this to be a conversation we have in Hope and beyond. Lord, thank you that scholars, editors, translators, manuscript writers, so many hands have preserved this letter for us and translated it and passed it down, and we are so grateful that this treasure is so accessible to us now, physically, digitally, in so many languages so easily. And we want to treasure it, we want to steward it, we want to steward the conversation. So we invite you, Holy Spirit, to come to us, amongst us in Hope as we go through Romans, both with Bible with Bill and also on the Sunday mornings, to really bring us all fresh revelation of what God has achieved through Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
Brilliant. Bye from us.
Bye, everyone.